Okay, hey guys, welcome to the Bolivia episode. This is episode number 2 in our podcast series where I'm sort of like going through the alphabet and I'm not making episodes about every country. I wish I could make this a full-time job and do that, but I'm picking the stories that interest me the most and kind of stick with me and I actually genuinely find myself talking to my friends about. And I don't know if they are retelling them. I think they might be. Some of them are pretty crazy. And this one certainly is. Today we are talking about Bolivia. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I am ashamed to say I had no idea about Bolivia at all before I started this research. And there is a hugely deep history, very, very rich history that I would love to go into, but we're not going to go into the entirety of Bolivia in 20 minutes. We are going to tell one particular story, which is both a story of hope and a story of American interference in the most ridiculous, unbelievable way. So here we go. If you're watching on YouTube, I have written some notes down, so if you see me looking at my laptop, just go about your day and do some cleaning, close your eyes, have a nap. Don't have a nap if you're driving, obviously. And if you're here on Spotify, hello, thank you for listening. My name is Kate Miller, and you're listening to Between Courses, Episode 2, Bolivia. You're standing on a perfectly flat expanse of white. It goes in every direction, and there's nothing there. There's no trees, no buildings, no horizon line you can make sense of. It's just white. And then it rains. Just a little bit, but just enough to put a thin sheet of water over the surface. And suddenly you're standing on a mirror, the size of a small country. The sky is below you and the clouds are under your feet. You literally cannot tell which way is up. This is the Salar de Uyuni in Bolivia. Over 9,000 square kilometers of crystallized salt in the Andes Mountains. And if you've not seen photos, definitely Google it now. If I have the editing skills, I'm going to put a photo here. Tourists go there and take these sort of like very goofy forced perspective photos where it looks like your friend is sort of standing on your palm or you're being chased by a toy dinosaur because of this reflection. The lighting is so brilliantly fun to play with. But here's what nobody tells you about when you're posing for these pictures, is that beneath your feet, beneath the surreal white crust, there lies the largest lithium reserve on the planet. That's 21 million metric tons of lithium. And that is the thing that your phone battery is relying upon right now, or if you have an electric car, that's what it's running on. God, there's a lot of subtle foreshadowing going on in this podcast already. And it's the thing that, every car company on earth is desperate for. Tesla. I don't know if that came out very cool. Anyway, so it is the element that's supposed to save us from climate change, but is also crucially a finite element. And a fifth of the world's supply is sitting underneath this very crust of salt. 500 years ago, the world came to Bolivia for another mineral, buried in another impossible landscape. And that mineral was silver. And when I say the world, I mean the Spanish. It's always the Spanish. South America, who colonized it? The Spanish. Okay. They found it inside a mountain so high that you could barely breathe at the top. They ended up calling this the Rich Mountain. They built a city bigger than London to dig it out, and they killed millions of people extracting it. That's not an exaggeration, millions. And when they were done, they left. The Spanish left, and they left Bolivia with the hollowed out mountain, the graves, and pretty much nothing else apart from a local elite that continued the same oppressive practices. Now, when I say a lot of silver, actually it was chronicled by a chronicler that there was enough silver to build a bridge from Bolivia to Madrid and back again. Whether that's true or not, we don't know, but there was certainly a lot of silver. There was a lot of effort that went into digging this stuff out and a lot of oppression that went with it. So when the world looks at Bolivia today and says like, hey guys, fancy giving us some of that lithium, you'd expect the Bolivians to not be super excited about that. Okay, so before we get into the history, I need you to understand the geography, because Bolivia isn't just like super awesome, beautiful scenery. The land actually is the story. And every conflict, every revolution, every heartbreak in this country's history comes back to what the land looks like and what is hiding, more importantly, beneath it. So it's right in the middle of South America, landlocked, no coastline, and we're absolutely going to talk about that later because it is also a national trauma that is very much alive and well, and honestly an insane story. It's bordered by 5 countries: Brazil, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Paraguay. And inside these borders, Bolivia's got it all. It's got glaciers, the Amazon rainforest, it's got desert, salt flats, cloud forests also. You should Google that if you don't know what it is. Better than I can explain it. Just look at a picture. The western third is dominated by the Andes, 2 enormous mountain ranges running north to south. And between them is this high plateau called the Altiplano. But basically it looks like a table. It's incredibly flat. Now put that table at 3,750 meters above sea level, which is 12,000 feet if you're American listening. And it's the most extensive high plateau on Earth outside of Tibet. And this freezing, sun-blasted, oxygen-thin plateau is where the majority of Bolivians have actually lived for thousands of years. La Paz, the capital, La Paz sits in a canyon carved into the edge of this table at about 3,600 meters. It's the highest capital city in the entire world, and you get off a plane and you feel that immediately. So I've been told, haven't gone yet, but hopefully when this podcast comes out, maybe we'll get an invite to Bolivia. What's up, tourism ministry? Anyway, we can imagine together that your heart is a bit racing and the air just feels thinner. You're out of breath, you're walking through the baggage claim, and visiting diplomats learn quite quickly to take the stairs slowly and say no to a second glass of wine at dinner. I read a blog post about this. You can get very, very drunk in this high altitude. Okay, so above La Paz, perched on the rim of a canyon, is El Alto. And this is a city of over 1 million people, and they're mostly indigenous. This is very key. It sits at 4,100 meters. And when you fly into La Paz, you actually land in El Alto. You land at 13,000 feet, and then you drive like down into the capital. And El Alto is one of the fastest growing cities in South America, which will also become very important in our story. So remember that name. Now let's go to the northern end of the Altiplano, and you hit Lake Titicaca. Straddling the Peruvian border, it's the largest lake in South America. And this is at 3,800 meters. Because what matters is that in Andean cosmology, this lake was the center of creation. It was the birthplace of the sun, the moon, the first humans. And when you see it, this very vast, impossible blue body of water shimmering from the top of the world, you can understand why someone sitting there 4,000 years ago would have thought, yeah, this is it. This is the center. This is where it all began. Okay, so then we swing east and we'll come down off the mountains, and Bolivia just transforms. The eastern lowlands are tropical, humid, Amazonian. Think jaguars, pink river dolphins, more species of butterfly than most countries have species of anything. And it's like a different planet. And this east-west divide, highlands versus the lowlands, indigenous versus European descended, traditional versus modernism, is one of the most fundamental fault lines in Bolivian society. And it runs through everything, every election, every crisis, every argument, and who Bolivia is and who gets to decide. So we're going to keep this in mind. There are 2 Bolivias. There's one up high and one down low. So long before anyone called this place Bolivia, long before the Spanish showed up, long before the Inca, there was an extraordinary civilization on the shores of Lake Titicaca that almost nobody talks about. Tiwanaku. Have you heard of the Tiwanaku? Because I had not heard of them. And I get it. It doesn't get the press that the Maya or the Aztecs or even the Inca got. But it should, because what these people accomplished is staggering. So if you picture this, you're at nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, the air is thin, temperature swings 40 degrees between noon and midnight, the soil is marginal at best. What do? You build a monumental city of carved stone. Temples, plazas, administrative complexes, you create a network of raised agricultural fields with sophisticated irrigation channels that essentially allow you to farm the unfarmable. 50,000 of these raised fields surrounding the city at 13,000 feet. It's one of the great agricultural innovations of the ancient world. And at its peak, around roughly 500 to 900 AD, Tiwanaku was the capital of an empire that stretched across most of the southern Andes. Maybe 500,000 people under its influence, and they carved the Gateway of the Sun, this astonishing monolithic archway with a central figure scholars call the Staff God, flanked with rows of winged attendants. Also something to Google, or maybe it's here, we'll find out. When I say here to the podcast listeners, I'm pointing. Maybe at nothing. And around 1100 AD, there was a drought, a severe, prolonged drought, and the rain stopped, the fields failed, and this whole empire collapsed. But the people didn't vanish, and the descendants became the Aymara, one of the two great indigenous nations of modern Bolivia. When the Inca expanded southward in the 15th century and they absorbed Altiplano, they looked at Tiwanaku's ruins and thought, the gods built this. The gods must have built this. Who could build this? It's amazing. And so they borrowed it and they learned from it. When I say they borrowed, they kind of moved in. So essentially, Bolivia has an incredibly rich indigenous culture, all while, Europe is still figuring out how to grow crops. So they were very advanced, is what I'm saying. Okay, so the story gets kind of dark here. And when I say dark, I mean like really, really, really colonialism coded dark. So it's 1545 and an indigenous prospector named Diego Jalupa finds silver on a towering cone-shaped mountain in the eastern Andes. The mountain is called Cerro Rico, Rich Mountain, and it stands 4,800 meters above sea level, containing the single most concentrated silver deposit ever found on Earth. Now, what happens next is one of the most consequential events in global economic history and one of the most horrific chapters in human suffering. Within decades, a city erupts at the base of the mountain. And by 1600, Potosi, the city, has a population of 160,000 people, making it larger than London, larger than Paris, and larger than any city in the Americas. So it's one of the biggest cities on Earth at the time, and it's sitting at over 4,000 meters in freezing temperatures in the middle of nowhere because underneath the mountain is more money than anyone had ever seen. So between the 16th and 18th centuries, 80% of the world's silver supply came out of this mountain, and over 40,000 tons were shipped across the Atlantic to Spain. It financed wars, built cathedrals, flooded the economies of Europe and Asia, and it made its way all the way to China. Historians argued pretty convincingly that this single mountain created the first truly globalized economy. So who dug it out? The Spanish took an old Inca labor system called the mita, which under the Inca had been a kind of communal work obligation, a you do your part in the community benefits arrangement, and they turned it into something monstrous, forced labor. 13,000 indigenous men at a time dragged into the mines, and they worked in near total darkness, in tunnels where the air was poisoned, using mercury to process the silver, mercury that seeped into their lungs, their bloodstreams, their bones, and shifts lasted days. The miners were often locked inside, and around 30,000 enslaved Africans were brought to Potosi too, working as human pack animals on the mountains. The death toll is debated, but the scale is not. Some historians estimate 8 million people died in the mines of Potosi over 3 centuries. Whether that number is precise, I can't tell you, but Eduardo Galeano, the great Uruguayan writer, put it in this way. The amount of silver extracted from Cerro Rico could have built a bridge from Potosi to Madrid, and the number of people who died extracting it could have built another bridge of bones right next to it. The silver left, all of the silver left, and it went to Spain, to Europe and Asia, and Bolivia got absolutely nothing, apart from an emptied mountain, the poisoned earth, and the dead. And mining continues at Cerro Rico today, literally right now. The miners, many of them are young, many of them are desperately poor, still work with minimal equipment, still breathe the dust and die young, and their life expectancy hovers around 40. Deep in the tunnels, they maintain shrines to a figure called El Tío, a devil figure, red-faced, sitting in the dark, draped in offerings of cigarettes, coca leaves, and alcohol. And you make your deal with El Tío before you go in. You ask him to let you come out alive, because that mountain has been eating people for 500 years and it has not stopped. So Potosi is not just history, it's the wound that never closed. It's the template for every extractive relationship Bolivia ever had with the outside world.
Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want you thinking this is a story of passive victimhood. It's not at all. The Bolivian people, and especially the indigenous people, have been fighting back from the very beginning, and some of these fights are genuinely extraordinary. And as a result of these fights, they achieved independence from Spain in 1825 after a brutal 16-year war. The new country was named Bolivia after Simón Bolívar, the great liberator, partly out of genuine admiration and partly, some historians suspect, because the founders figured that naming your country after the most powerful man on the continent was a good way to keep him from opposing your independence, which is pretty smart politics. But the thing is, independence did not bring justice. The elite, these were Spanish-descended families born in the Americas, took over from the Peninsular Spanish and basically kept the same system running. Indigenous people remained excluded, exploited, and invisible, and the revolution was a change of management, not a change of structure. So Bolivia started losing things, big things. In 1879, Chile invaded during the War of the Pacific and seized Bolivia's entire coastline, the whole coastline. I'd be so mad. Bolivia went from a maritime nation to a landlocked one overnight. In Bolivia, this is a living wound. Every March 23rd, Bolivians commemorate the Day of the Sea. There are marches, there are speeches. The Bolivian Navy, Bolivia still has a navy, patrols Lake Titicaca and the rivers, keeping itself in readiness for a coastline that has been gone for nearly a century and a half. And in 2018, actually, Bolivia brought this case to the ICJ in The Hague, asking Chile to negotiate the return of sovereign access to the Pacific, and they lost. Then in the 1930s, the Chaco War against Paraguay came, fought over the Gran Chaco lowlands, supposedly rich in oil. And Bolivia, bigger army, more people, more resources, lost catastrophically. They conscripted indigenous men from the Altiplano, men who'd never left their villages, never experienced tropical heat, and shipped them to Chaco, where the heat, the dehydration and disease, and the Paraguayan army destroyed them. And Bolivia lost about 65,000 soldiers and another huge chunk of its territory. And actually, the punchline of that is there has been no oil found at all in the land that Paraguay won. But something happened in this aftermath that nobody expected. The survivors actually came home changed. These were indigenous men who had been told that their whole lives didn't matter and they weren't really citizens, that Bolivia belonged to the white families in the big houses. And then they'd been sent to die in a war started by those same families. So they came back radicalized. They came back furious and they started organizing. The revolution came on April 9th, 1952. Before it, the numbers were obscene. 72% of the population worked 3% of the land. Only about 5% of Bolivians, the white, literate, property-owning elite, could vote. 3 tin mining families, the tin barons, controlled more wealth than the government, and Bolivia was essentially a feudal state with a flag. And then the revolutionary nationalist movement launched an armed uprising. They seized arsenals, they distributed weapons to civilians, armed miners marched on La Paz with dynamite strapped to their bodies, and after 3 days of street fighting and around 600 dead, the military actually surrendered. So reforms came really quickly after this. Universal suffrage, agrarian land reform, nationalization of the tin mines, rural education programs. For the first time in Bolivia's history, there was a genuine sustained effort to include the indigenous majority in national life. And it was one of the only true social revolutions in Latin American history. But revolutions are much easier to start than to sustain, and the economy buckled. The factions splintered, and the US got nervous, because this is around the Cold War time, right? Anything that smelled like socialism in Latin America made Washington reach for its checkbooks and its CIA Rolodex. And by 1964, a military coup ended the democratic experiment. So what followed was decades of military dictatorships, counter-coups, chaos. Bolivia had experienced something like 190 coups since independence, a number that is so absurd that it's almost funny, except it isn't, because people died in every single one. And during this era, in 1967, the Che Guevara showed up in Bolivia's eastern lowlands, convinced he could spark a continent-wide guerrilla revolution. And it went badly. Local peasants didn't rally to his cause. The Bolivian military, with CIA assistance, turned him down and executed him. Even revolutionaries from outside, it seems, underestimated Bolivia. Wow, the sunset is so beautiful if you're watching the video. Just realizing it's setting behind me, so I need to try and speak a little bit faster or we're going to be sitting in darkness. So then came the neoliberal era in the 1980s and the 1990s, a structural adjustment, privatization. Bolivia sold off its natural resources like tin and gas and water to foreign companies at the urging of the IMF and the World Bank. And the economy stabilized on paper, but the gap between the rich and the poor yawned wider. And the indigenous majority, which was still the majority, but also still marginalized, watched as these things that belonged to everyone were sold to people from somewhere else. But the Bolivian people were about to do something extraordinary. In 1999, the Bolivian government, under pressure from the World Bank, privatized the water supply of Cochabamba, the country's third largest city. They handed it to a consortium led by the American corporation Bechtel. Almost immediately, water rates shot up, and in some cases by 50% or more. The people of Cochabamba said no, and what followed became known as the Guerra del Agua, the water war. Mass protests, road blockades, general strikes, and the government declared martial law. A 17-year-old boy named Victor Hugo Daza was shot and killed by security forces, and still the people did not back down. By April 2000, the government caved, Bechtel was expelled, and the water was returned to public control. And it was the first time a major privatization had been reversed by popular protests in the neoliberal era. And it sent shockwaves, not just through Bolivia, but through the entire global debate about privatization, development, and who owns the things that keep people alive. Then in 2003, the government announced plans to export natural gas, Bolivia's vast reserves, through a pipeline to Chile. And that gas would then be sold cheaply to the USA, processed abroad, and the profits would flow again outward. The protests that erupted became known as the Guerra del Gas, the gas war, and they entered on El Alto, that indigenous city perched above La Paz, and hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets. Road blockades paralyzed the country. The government, under President Sanchez, known as Goni, responded with military force, and over 60 people were killed. Goni fled the country. He ended up in the United States, and Bolivia was in crisis. But out of that crisis, a movement was coalescing, a movement that has been building for decades and centuries and only just found its voice. Evo Morales. Evo Morales was born in 1959 in a tiny village in the department of Oroyo on the Altiplano. His family were subsistence farmers, indigenous and poor. 4 of his 6 siblings died in infancy, and 4 out of 7 children were dead before they could grow up. As a kid, Evo herded llamas. He played the trumpet in a band and reportedly walked kilometers to school. The family eventually moved to the Chapare region, the tropical lowlands, where, like many displaced Altiplano families, they became coca farmers. Coca, we're talking about the leaf, not the drug, is one of the most important plants in Andean culture. It has been cultivated and used for at least 4,000 years, and indigenous people chew it for energy, for altitude sickness, and for ceremony. And it's also the raw material for cocaine. When processed with chemicals in labs, it becomes something entirely different. And the US-led war on drugs made absolutely no distinction there. To Washington, coca was cocaine and was evil, and the coca-growing regions of Bolivia were targets for eradication. US-backed soldiers would come into farming communities, destroy their fields, beat and arrest farmers. So imagine someone coming to the Napa Valley and ripping up all the grapevines because wine can be abused. It's basically roughly the emotional equivalent for Bolivians. So Evo Morales became a cocalero leader, a union organizer for the coca farmers, and he was really good at it. He was charismatic, tireless, fearless, and sometimes reckless. He got beaten up, he got arrested, he was kind of a badass. He once got dragged barefoot through the countryside by soldiers, and every single time he came back. And in the late 1990s, he entered politics, winning a seat in Congress. In 2002, he ran for president and came in a close second, a result that shocked everyone, including apparently him. But the incredible part is that the US ambassador at the time, Manuel Rocha, gave a speech days before the election, essentially telling Bolivians not to vote for him, warning that the US aid could be cut off. And the effect was the opposite of what Rocha intended. Bolivians, who, if you've not been paying attention, don't love it when you tell them what not to do, rallied to him, and his numbers surged. In December 2005, he actually won the presidency with 53.7% of the vote, which was an absolute landslide, and Bolivia's first indigenous president was sworn in. So what did he do with his power? He did a lot. He renamed the country the plurinational state of Bolivia in the constitution, recognizing the 36 indigenous nations and their languages. Rights of Mother Earth were written into law. He nationalized the gas industry, renegotiated the contracts so Bolivia kept more of the money, and it worked. GDP per capita actually roughly tripled, and extreme poverty got cut by more than half. He built roads, hospitals, schools, and a massive cable car system connecting El Alto to La Paz. He kicked out the US Drug Enforcement Administration and replaced the coca policy with one that actually reduced excess culmination better than the American version had. So by objective measures, this was absolutely transformative for Bolivia. But power does things to people, and the constitution he championed said he could run for 2 terms. He wanted a third, and he held a referendum. The people said no, and he ran anyway. He got a court pact with his allies to say term limits violated his human rights, and this made a lot of people quite furious, including people who'd voted for him twice. But then came October 2019, and he runs for a fourth term. Election night, the count freezes for 24 hours, and when it restarts, the numbers swung hard in his favour. So initially he was kind of getting the same amount of votes as everyone else, but then right at the end, they swung hard in his favour. And essentially the opposition screamed fraud, and the Organisation of American States ran an audit on this, backing them up. And what happened was basically a military general then goes on the TV and says, Morales, you need to step down. And 24 hours later, he's on a plane to Mexico. Pretty crazy. So then this new government walk in, and they're very Christian, they're very America focused, and they are completely anti-Indigenous rights. So they start stripping Indigenous rights. Indigenous symbolism is ripped off of formal symbols, even like the police uniform, and there are huge protests, and 22 people actually get killed, all of whom were Indigenous. And what they do primarily is the first thing is they open up the lithium reserves to foreign investment from the United States of America. And Elon Musk tweets that basically this was a very successful coup. He did delete that tweet though. So all very suspicious. And so while this new government is in power, there are statisticians who are running the numbers again, and they basically say, backed by MIT, guys, you've got this really wrong. Obviously, right at the end, the numbers surge because this is when the Indigenous votes come in, because the infrastructure to get these votes is far less developed than in the cities who were voting for the other candidates. So all of the Indigenous votes came in at the end of the day. So basically Morales had actually legitimately won that election. New elections in 2020 put Evo's party back in power under Luis Arce. Bolivia sort of stabilized, but it remains deeply polarized. It's economically strained and sits on top of the biggest unanswered question in history, which is the lithium. 21 million metric tons of lithium, and the world needs it for your phone, your electric car, the entire green energy transition. And Bolivia's position has been pretty simple. We are not doing this again. We develop it ourselves or we don't develop it at all. And that's meant pretty slow progress. Bolivia produces less than 1% of global lithium right now, while Chile and Argentina are cashing in on it. So yeah, you can call that pretty impractical, but when your country has 500 years of evidence showing exactly what happens when you let outsiders control the thing they want from you, moving slow isn't just stubbornness and being difficult, it's their survival instinct. So yeah, that is the story of Bolivia.
Okay, my phone just died as I was finishing that video, and I was distraught for seconds until we recovered it. So, thank you for listening. Let me know what you thought of the episode, and yeah, let me know which one you'd like a podcast on next. I really enjoy these. They just take a minute, so bear with me. Cool. All right. Bye.